Okay, we are almost finished with the first slide set, which is set A. And really, there's two more slide sets, but set A is by far the most important and has the most information that you're going to see again on the exam. So I went slower with these slides, but I'll go a lot faster through set B and C. So anyway, I do want to finish up this last couple of slides. One condition you probably heard of before is rigor mortis. Rigor mortis sets in 3 to 4 hours after a person has died, and the muscles begin to stiffen, okay? And the peak of rigor mortis occurs about 12 hours after death. And so maybe within 24 hours or so, definitely by the second day after death, rigor mortis is the stiffening goes away, you know. And so what causes the stiffening is has to do with the fact that a dead person doesn't produce ATP. So if you remember, ATP was needed for the detachment of the myosin from the actin. So while the myosin is attached, the muscles are contracted. So if there's no ATP to cause that myosin to detach, it stays in this condition because the ATP is not being synthesized, the myosin heads stay bound. They don't detach, so they stay bound to actin, causing a constant state of contraction. But eventually, after about 24 hours, the muscle proteins start breaking down because of decomposition of the body. And once those muscle proteins begin to break down, that causes the myosin to release, even without ATP. All right, and now we're going to switch to slide set B. Oh, sorry. All right, slide set B. And like I say, I'm going to go a little faster through this because I won't ask a whole lot of questions about it, but there will be some. All right, so chapter 9, slide set B. The definition of muscle tension is the force exerted on a load or the object to be moved. So muscle tension is the force exerted on a load. So if you're just, let's just say you're doing a bicep curl, you're lifting weights and you're doing a bicep curl. So it's the force exerted on that weight that you're lifting, okay? The force that it takes to lift that weight. And contraction produces muscle tension, which is a force, to do some kind of work. There are two types of contraction. In isometric, the muscle contracts, but there's no muscle tension increases, but it doesn't exceed the load. So there's no shortening of the muscle. So in other words, isometric, there's no shortening. You may have heard of isometric exercises. So there are the types of exercises you can do. But isotonic is when there is shortening of the muscle. So that would be more like the bicep curl. So if I push against a wall, I'm not going to move that wall, and my muscle isn't going to shorten, but it's going to contract. So if I push against a wall and try to move it, that's isometric. If I do a bicep curl, that's isotonic. Another definition that you need is motor unit. So a motor unit is the motor neuron, and its muscle fiber that it stimulates. It's the nerve muscle functional unit is how it's defined. Here's what I wanted. It's the motor neuron in all the muscle fibers, because one motor neuron can stimulate from 4 to several hundred muscle fibers at one time because of the branches, because the axon branches. If it's a smaller number of muscle fibers, so it's a smaller motor unit, so let's say it's just 4 muscle fibers, then it's going to be fine movements like the movements of the eye. If it's several hundred muscle fibers in a motor unit, it's going to be large movements like from a thigh muscle, big, large movements. So this is showing you 2 motor units. Motor unit 1 is shown in purple, and it's stimulating 2 different muscle fibers. Motor unit 2 is stimulating 3 different muscle fibers. Okay, so before you can have a sustained contraction, like what you would need to lift a weight, for example, the contraction comes from adding up or summating these individual tiny contractions called muscle twitches. So a muscle twitch is the simplest contraction. It's not going to lead to anything, any big, movement of the muscle or anything. But a muscle twitch is the simplest contraction, and it results from the muscle fiber's response to a single action potential from a motor neuron. So basically, a twitch is when the muscle fiber contracts quickly and then relaxes. The phases of a muscle twitch are the latent period, and what happens there is the events of excitation, contraction, coupling, where that ends with myosin attaching to actin, but no power stroke yet. And then there's the contraction period where the tension increases, and that's where the myosin pulls on the actin. And then there's the relaxation. So there's the latent period, the contraction, the relaxation, and that is the phases of a muscle twitch. So it's basically a single contraction cycle. And it comes from one action potential at one motor neuron, the action potential arriving from one motor neuron to the fibers that it stimulates. So the contractions of our eye muscles, if you think about just when you blink or when you move your eyes, they're rapid and brief. Eye muscle contractions are rapid and brief. They're not sustained and they're not strong contractions. Okay, so those are more like a muscle twitch, whereas when we use our calf muscles, like let's just say that we do that exercise where you stand on your toes, where you plantar flexion, where you stand on your toes and you work your gastrocnemius calf muscle. So you do that for a little bit. That's going to be a sustained contraction, not a muscle twitch. That's going to be adding many, many muscle twitches together, and it's going to come from many, many action potentials, the addition of many action potentials. So this is showing just a muscle twitch from 3 different muscles. The lateral rectus, which is an eye muscle, and you can see that muscle twitch is very brief. A muscle twitch from the gastrocnemius, which is the calf muscle, and then the soleus, which is also a calf muscle, but it is a synergist to the gastrocnemius. The gastrocnemius is the large calf muscle that we see in our calf portion of our leg, and the soleus is underneath it. It's deep to the gastrocnemius. So anyway, and that one has a longer, more drawn out muscle twitch. So we'll just read this section because it kind of explains how different muscles respond. Normal muscle contraction is relatively smooth, and its strength varies with the needs of that the person has. A muscle twitch is seen only really in the lab setting, or with neuromuscular problems. But normal muscle, we really don't see muscle twitches that often. What we normally see are graded muscle responses, varying strengths of contraction for different demands. And those graded responses are required for control of skeletal movement, for proper control of skeletal movement. Because you don't want to use too much strength to pick up something that doesn't weigh very much, but you want to use a whole lot more strength to pick up something heavy. So the responses are graded or varied by changing the frequency of stimulation. So the more often you have action potentials firing, the stronger that muscle response is going to be. Then we can also change the strength of the stimulation, and we'll talk about how. So you can have individual twitches that come, they occur. You have the contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. This is in milliseconds. So when a twitch happens, one right after the other, we call this temporal summation. That temporal means time. So wave summation or temporal summation is adding up muscle twitches, one right after the other. It's dealing with the frequency of the muscle twitches. Okay, so sometimes the muscle twitches come so fast, and this is what normally happens when we want to use a muscle. We want to use it all the way. We don't want muscle twitches because they're not effective. So the twitches only will have partial relaxation, and that's an example of temporal or wave summation, and we call that incomplete tetanus. Incomplete tetanus, okay? But complete tetanus is what we need. This is incomplete tetanus. It's when you have the summation or adding of the muscle twitches. They're coming very fast, but not fast enough to where they're actually fused together in what we call complete tetanus. For a muscle to actually work, we need it to go into complete tetanus. So we need many, many twitches to happen like very fast in succession, one right after the other. So they're happening so fast, we don't even notice it. All we notice is that the entire muscle contracts, and the contraction is strong enough to lift whatever object that we're trying to lift. So this is what fused tetanus looks like. You don't even see any kind of wave, any kind of dip in the graph here. It's just a fusing of all of those muscle twitches, okay? So that means they're happening very fast, and they're all added together. All right, so as far as the muscle responding to changes in stimulus strength, that comes from something called recruitment. So we can recruit more motor units, and recruitment is when the stimulus is sent to more muscle fibers, so more motor units are activated, and that leads to more precise control. And recruitment has to do with increasing the strength of the muscle contraction. So basically that is how we have graded muscle responses, is by changing the frequency, is by increasing the frequency of our stimulus and recruiting more motor units. All right. The term muscle tone. Muscle tone is the constant, slightly contracted state of all of our muscles. That's why they have a shape, especially people who exercise and they are in shape, and younger people tend to have more muscle tone. Muscle tone keeps the muscles firm, healthy, and ready to respond. All right, we talked about isotonic contractions, that is when your muscle actually shortens. So that's like if you lift weights. So when the muscle shortens and does work, like a bicep is contracting to pick up a book, that is a concentric contraction. And an eccentric if the muscle lengthens. So when you put the book back down, it's an eccentric contraction. All right, so here you see a concentric contraction. When here's the regular length of the bicep muscle, and then here is when it's picking up a 3 kilogram weight. And then an eccentric contraction, there's not a picture of it, but anyway, it's just when the weight is put back down, okay? Isometric contractions are when the load is too great and your muscles contract, but there's no shortening of the muscle because the weight is too great, you can't move it. And this is what an isometric contraction looks like. This 6 kilograms is too much for that bicep to lift. So there is a contraction of the muscle. It contracts when it tries to lift that weight, but it doesn't actually shorten because it can't. Okay. All right, so the energy for contraction comes from ATP. The ATP is used by the muscle for moving and detaching cross bridges. So the detachment of the cross bridge happens when ATP binds to myosin. The movement happens when the ADP and the phosphate release from the myosin. ATP is required to pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember, it's released so that it can bind to troponin and expose those cross bridges, expose those actin binding sites. So it has to be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum after that. And then ATP is required for the sodium-potassium pump. So it is required to pump sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell after the excitation contraction coupling. When sodium rushes in, depolarization, potassium rushes out, repolarization. So now the sodium has to go back out, the potassium has to come back in. So because we have to set up the original conditions across the sarcolemma. So ATP is used for a lot of different things, right? We need ATP for many different reasons. And where do we get ATP? Well, we can get ATP by removing a phosphate from creatine phosphate and adding it to ADP. We can get it from glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation when we've been exercising and we don't have enough oxygen available. And we can get it from aerobic cellular respiration, which is where you're going to get the most ATP. I'm not going to go into detail. Okay, and I'm going to stop here and I'm going to move on to slide set